All right. And you wanted to hear some answers to some questions, so we're doing a Q&A video to wrap up our Wandering in the Wilderness Bible study. This is a special Easter edition to just wrap up. So why don't you handle the first question we got, Ryan?
Sure. The first question we got is kind of what is the significance of the number 40, the 40 years that the Israelites wandered in the wilderness? Now, of course, kind of the first reference that we tend to make with that during Lent is the 40 days that Jesus spends in the wilderness after his baptism, preparing for his ministry. It's at that point that he's tempted. But there are, some other kind of references there. Of course, there was 40 days and 40 nights that both Noah spends, that it rains while Noah is in the ark. It's 40 days and 40 nights that Moses is on the mountain with God, receiving those 10 commandments and the other commandments that he receives. So, 40 tends to be a number that is, considered like a big number, but not like an impossible number. You could kind of enumerate 40. So 40 tends to be one of those numbers that kind of pops up in the Bible over and over again. So,
all right, one of the other questions that we got was, where are we being led after sacrificing or having taken on more during Lent? So the question is, what happens next? If you gave up something, if you took on something, if you were trying a new spiritual practice during the season of Lent, what's next? Because there are times, and let me just honestly confess, I've given up things like Coke or soda for the season of Lent. Brian did this one year, and what we made sure to have on Easter morning was an entire 2-liter of what you gave up, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying he chugged it all in one sip, but it was pretty close. I've done similar, where that one thing that I gave up, I was ready to have it on Easter morning, and especially for preachers who have to get up early for sunrise, we need to have something to help motivate us. Mm-hmm. So sometimes when I've given up things like giving up soda, it was in an effort to say, I want to make other healthier trends. And this is a good time to think about sacrificing something that I wouldn't think nothing of, going to the store, buying myself a Coke, drinking it, doing it lots of times. So having to choose something else, having to make other arrangements, having to feed my body something better as opposed to something like Coke, which isn't the best for you, but I still love it. Having to make that change or sacrifice, there's time just to reflect on what it is about making that change, what that did during that period of time. Did you feel better, feel worse? How did you do getting over those headaches that happen from giving up things like that? You can reflect on those changes. My hope was that it would jumpstart making changes and maybe even drinking less soda in the future. Now, unfortunately, that did not happen for me. I have had a church member once that gave up all sodas for the season of Lent, and I just saw her recently, and 4 years later, she still hasn't had any soda. She made healthy changes. So different things happens when you sacrifice something. And then there's also when you take on something. I'm hoping in taking on something, again, you can reflect on the meaning. What did you get out of it? If it was making sure you gave more money to certain missions or to certain charities, how did that make you feel? If it was you were making sure to give more of your time to something, again, reflect on it. How does it feel in your soul having done this? And then I think post-Easter, it's, well, what changes do I need to make? But all of these are not just about how we feel as individuals, having sacrificed something or having taken on something to give more of ourselves in certain areas, but how does it affect our relationship with Jesus? Does it deepen it? Does it help us to draw closer to some of the teachings of Jesus' healing and sacrifice? Those are questions we have to answer for ourselves. And at the end of the day, if it didn't help, then you need to examine that and to see what it does for you. But I think post-Easter, it's still about how do we grow in our relationship with Christ. And I think there's lots of ways that we can look at that, and maybe it's another 30 days of giving something up. I think there's all sorts of things that we can do. I think the season of Lent builds in because, like we just talked about in the significance of 40, Jesus was in the wilderness for 40 days. For us to spend that time in the wilderness, exploring, thinking, praying, taking on something new, sacrificing something that we would think nothing of, letting ourselves have, we get to reflect on what our relationship with Christ looks like, what that looks like to walk alongside Jesus in that journey, and we get to find some answers for ourselves.
One last question that we received. How do you explain how God was ready to do away with the Israelites when they built the golden calf, and then go so far as to have his son go through all he did during his last week on earth for the world? Wow, that's a good question. And to answer that question, I can't help but hearken back to what we did on Good Friday, and as we read the reproaches that night. And there was an intermingling of Israel's wilderness experience and Christ's passion. We heard things like, I guided you through the wilderness. I fed you manna from heaven and water from a rock, and still you turned your back. I led you with a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire, and you led me to Pilate's court. I think that probably more than try to kind of separate God's response to human sin in the Exodus and in Christ's passion, I would look at how they're kind of alike in this situation. God is certainly just as much as it is at the golden calf, God is disappointed in our sin. And maybe sometimes God is maybe not willing to do away with us, but certainly willing to let that play out, let the punishment in that sin, let us experience that. I would say that God certainly did a lot for Israel, beginning with kind of the display of power in Egypt in the 10 plagues, wandering through the Red Sea, which then closed in on the Egyptian chariots, providing manna, providing water, leading them into a promised land and giving them victory over the people who were there. God was, in all of this, willing to do so much for Israel. And yet Israel said no. Israel said no there at the golden calf. Israel says no when they've settled in the land and they build altars and high places. And there again, God says, maybe it's time that you go into exile, that you be dominated by another empire. But even then, after 70 years, God says that's enough. And it's time to bring you back. It's time to redeem you from that period of exile. I don't think that, fundamentally God was angry at the golden calf, but at the same time, God ultimately did not give up on Israel. God ultimately does not give up on us and will, even through that period of punishment, I think try to bring us back, to woo us back, to reach out in love and forgiveness and grace so that we may rediscover God.
Well, thank you for joining us for this Lenten Bible study, and I hope you enjoyed this Q&A session. If you have thoughts on another Bible study you'd like to see, a topic, a book of the Bible, a subject that we could approach, don't hesitate to put that down in the comments and let us know. Not saying when we're going to have another Bible study, but we look forward to your feedback and want to know what you want to learn about next. Go with God and go with grace.